I was smoothing a ribbon across my wedding mood board when my phone lit with James' name, the familiar spark rushing through me like it always did. 3 months from now, I'd be walking down an aisle toward him, toward the promise of forever. "Hey, almost done with work. I was thinking we could." My voice trailed off as silence pressed back, broken only by his breathing heavy and distant. "Something isn't right, Davina." His voice had lost its usual softness, replaced with something hollow. "I can't do this." The pen slipped from my fingers, drawing a crooked blue line across the sample invitation I'd been admiring. "Can't do what? The caterer meeting? We can reschedule the wedding?" "Us." Each word landed like a stone in my chest. The room tilted, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself, magazines and swatches sliding to the floor. "James, what are you saying? Just yesterday, we were picking honeymoon destinations. Your family came to see me today. Your mother and Blair. They brought me documentation." His tone grew formal, clipped. "They showed me proof of things you never told me about: the alcoholism, the instability." My stomach iced over. "What? That's not true?" "They had medical records, Davina. Reports from a rehab stay last year. A therapist's letter recommending inpatient treatment after a breakdown in February." February. The month I worked 16-hour days on the Henderson wedding, the month James brought me soup when I caught a cold. "James, those are lies. I've never been in rehab. I was at that conference in Chicago. I have the badge, the photos, the contacts." His sigh carried the weight of finality. "I can't build a life on secrets. Goodbye." The call ended. My reflection stared back at me in the black phone screen. Blue eyes, wide lips, trembling hands shaking in betrayal's aftershock. Fragments of memory darted through my mind. Blair's flash of something sharp in her gaze. When I announced the engagement at Christmas, Elaine's voice pitched too bright. "Well, this is certainly a surprise." I thought of my college boyfriend, who vanished after one family dinner of the job interview that dissolved after Elaine checked my references of the clients who canceled after coincidentally running into Blair at a gala. A pattern emerged, cruel and deliberate. I blocked James on everything before the ache in my chest could turn into a collapse. 20 minutes later, I was parked outside Blair's sleek apartment building, heart-pounding. The elevator crawled to the 14th floor. She opened the door with a flute of champagne in her hand, skin gleaming under the soft light, her smile curling like smoke. "Well, hello, little sister. Shouldn't you be finalizing wedding plans?" Why, I asked, my voice low but sharp. "He deserved to know the truth," she said, casually sipping. "We were protecting him." "There is no truth. You fabricated everything." She leaned on the frame, blocking my path inside. "Did we? Or did you just convince yourself that your problems aren't real? That's what unstable people do." Heat surged into my face. "You destroyed my relationship, my engagement, my future. Why would you do that to me?" A flash of raw contempt crossed her features. "You're used to being abandoned anyway. Remember when Dad walked out when you were 16? He left because of your behavior." "No," I whispered, trembling. "He left because of Mom's affairs." Her smile never wavered. "Good luck convincing anyone to believe you over us." I walked back to my car with my chest hollow, but my mind sharpening. They hadn't just stolen James. They'd been stealing pieces of my life for years, and they weren't going to stop. The next morning, my hands still shook as I dialed the one number that came to mind. "Margaret Parker," came the brisk, professional voice. "Margaret, it's Davina Hughes. I need help. My mother and sister have been spreading lies, fabricated medical records, false stories. They've destroyed my engagement." There was a pause, then "Come to my office. If what you're saying is true, that's defamation, and we can fight that." For the first time since James's call, relief brushed against the raw wound inside me. Someone believed me. Her office smelled of leather and lavender law degrees lining the wall behind her, their gold seals catching the light. Margaret listened as I spilled everything: the phone call, Blair's smug confession, the patterns of sabotage I had long mistaken for coincidence. Her dark eyes stayed steady, her pen clicking rhythmically against the pad as she wrote. "You're not alone in this fight," she said finally, her hand firm on my shoulder. "Family wounds run deep, but they don't give anyone the right to destroy your life with lies." I could retreat into silence, lick my wounds in private, rebuild quietly. Or I could stand, fight, reclaim my truth. I lifted my chin, determination cutting through the grief. No more. The days after James' call blurred together, but Margaret did not allow me to collapse into grief. Instead, she drew me into her world of structure, timelines, and legal precision. Her office transformed into something like Command Central, the quiet click of her pen, punctuating the rhythm of strategy. With her guidance, what I had always chalked up to bad luck began to reveal itself as a deliberate pattern. She spread a large sheet across her desk, a timeline stretching from my college years to the present. "See this?" she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Every serious relationship you've had ended within 2 weeks of introducing them to your family. Every single one." I traced the line with my finger. Michael, my college boyfriend, gone days after dinner with Elaine and Blair. Thomas, from my first job, vanished after a barbecue. Jason, who had made me laugh until my stomach hurt, cold silence right after he bumped into Blair at a fundraiser. And James, 3 months before the wedding, erased by lies. Margaret placed printed emails beside the timeline, the paper crisp under her polished nails. Anonymous messages sent to each man. The language is nearly identical. For her own well-being. Unstable behavior. My throat tightened. "Where did you get these?" I called Michael after you left yesterday. He kept them, said something always felt off. The others forwarded theirs when I reached out. "Look here." She tapped one line highlighted in yellow. That phrase, "for her own well-being." Blair used the exact wording when you confronted her yesterday. It's a pattern, Davina. They've been rehearsing these lies for years. My head spun. And the conference in Chicago. They told James I was in rehab then. I have photos. Contacts. Margaret slid another sheet across the desk. Blair's handwriting. My stomach lurched at the sight of the familiar cursive. At the top, helping James see the truth. Item 1, Chicago rehab story. They planned it, I whispered, bile rising. They actually planned it. Not just the engagement, Margaret said firmly. She pulled a bulging folder forward. Neighbors, clients, colleagues. Your mother and sister have been seeding rumors everywhere. Your neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, told me Elaine expressed concerns for your stability. The Henderson wedding. Blair introduced the client to another planner and suggested you were unreliable. The evidence piled up like bricks around me. A cousin who stopped speaking after Elaine whispered troubles. Clients who canceled after Blair's chance meetings. Job interviews lost after reference checks. My phone vibrated. Dad's name glowed on the screen. Margaret motioned for me to answer on speaker. Davina, his voice strained. "Why didn't you tell me you went to rehab last year? We could have helped." My chest tightened. "Dad, I never went to rehab. I was at the conference. I have the badge, the receipts." Your mother showed me the admission papers. He interrupted. "Blair's worried about how you're handling the breakup. They say you're making accusations. They're lying, Dad. They've been lying for years." My voice broke. Silence. Then softly, "We'll talk when you're more stable." The line went dead. My world shrank to the 4 walls of Margaret's office. She pushed a box of tissues toward me, but I waved it away. "Tears won't help now," I whispered. "I need clarity." For the next hour, I filled a yellow legal pad with every suspicious incident I could remember. The internship that disappeared after Elaine met the director. The friend Sarah, who cut ties after her family invited me to dinner with mine. The apartment I lost, despite perfect credit. One by one, the moments of bad luck shifted into evidence of calculated sabotage. They didn't want me to succeed, I said, realization burning, because it threatened their narrative. Margaret leaned back, watching me with something like pride. We need to understand why. This goes beyond jealousy. She pulled financial records and social media histories into neat stacks. The picture sharpened into something uglier than I had feared. James came from money. His family's connections could elevate Blair's struggling interior design business. Elaine had borrowed money from them before. Blair's relationship with Thomas Andrews' heir to banking wealth depended on the family's spotless image. They weren't just trying to hurt you, Margaret said, her voice steady. They were protecting their access to power, to status. I thought of Blair's eyes at Christmas, the flicker of panic before her smile. Elaine's too bright voice. They'd been building a false image of me for years, planting seeds they could harvest when they needed to. My phone chimed. A text from an unknown number. Davina, it's Aunt Susan. I've been hearing rumors. I experienced the same treatment from your mother years ago. Call me another Buzz, Kevin, my former colleague. Blair approached 3 of our clients last year. I have documentation if you need it. A weight lifted slightly. I wasn't alone. Calls poured in as the day wore on, old clients, friends, relatives. Some had doubted me, some had distanced themselves, but many admitted they'd always felt something was off about Elaine and Blair's stories. Margaret outlined our options, cease and desist letters, gathering witness statements, preparing for a defamation suit. By evening, her office felt less like a legal chamber and more like a war room. Notes pinned to corkboards, documents in organized stacks, names circled and underlined. Each piece of evidence transformed my grief into focus. As I gathered my things to leave, I paused at the door. They've taken my fiancé. They've twisted my history. They've isolated me, but no more. Margaret nodded. Then let's show them the truth. The week unfolded as if someone had lifted a veil and let me finally see the machinery behind my life. With Margaret steering the process every day, began with coffee and ended with colored tabs sprouting from folders like a forest of resolve. My grief still pulsed under my skin, but it no longer ran the show. A cooler current moved through me now, one that sorted, named, and set boundaries. Calls came in steady as rain once the first brave few spoke up. Aunt Susan arrived with a tote bag of old letters and the kind of quiet fury that belongs to someone who has survived the same playbook and is done being polite about it. She flipped through decades of family correspondence and laid out how narratives had been bent until they snapped. In the mid-90s, a cousin had confronted Elaine about irregularities in our grandmother's estate, and within weeks, a whisper campaign labeled her unstable. She moved 2 states away, carrying a reputation she could never seem to shake. My chest ached with recognition. It was the same choreography with a different song. Margaret brought in a forensic document examiner who handled the forged rehab records like a surgeon, gloved hands, clean light, no drama. He mapped fonts, line weights, and metadata, tracing the documents to our family computer and the window of time when only Blair had access. A tech specialist traced the anonymous emails that had warned men away from me under the guise of concern, and when the IP address resolved to Elaine's home network at hours that lined up with Blair's social media posts from her own living room, I felt a strange blend of sickness and relief. This was ugly, yes, but it was clear. My Chicago conference receipts, hotel folio badge photos, and a smudged lanyard I had tossed in a drawer became anchors I kept returning to, not because I needed to prove reality to myself anymore, but because I liked the way truth felt when it took up physical space. Witnesses surfaced with stories that fit into the pattern like tiles in a mosaic. a client named Jennifer, admitted that Blair had pulled her aside at a charity gala, hinted at past incidents of professional negligence, and slid across what looked like a cease and desist letter from another firm warning about me. Jennifer, embarrassed, had canceled quietly because she did not want to be involved in drama. My former colleague Kevin said Blair had offered him referrals if he stopped sending work my way, all framed as what would be best for me while I recovered. The language repeated itself like an incantation, soft and reasonable, capable of slipping past a person's defenses before planting a seed of doubt that would sprout later into certainty. Even my neighbor confessed she had been pulled into hushed conversations at the mailbox where Elaine wrung her hands and fretted about my stability, sighing in that particular way that makes gossip feel like compassion. I learned to listen for the switch that always came in their stories the moment concern turned into control dressed as care. Margaret taught me to separate the emotional freight from the legal freight. One could rush, the other must not. She kept a running map on her wall that turned my history into a network diagram: relationships, meetings, cancellations, phone calls, all connected by thin lines of motive that converged in a few grim nodes. When I woke at 3 a.m, as I still sometimes did, the map hovered in my head until it settled into order and let me sleep again. My father called once more, repeating the phrases Elaine had given him, and I kept my voice even as I told him I would not discuss my stability as long as the conversation was framed by lies. It was a boundary he did not know where to place, so he hung up in weary confusion. I did not chase him this time. A small triumph came through an email from Michael, the college boyfriend, whose absence had always bruised a quiet corner of me. He had kept an old message because it smelled wrong at the time and sent it now with a careful apology. The words were familiar concern for my well-being, escalation, volatility, only now they were frozen in time with a date stamp 3 days after he'd met my family. Margaret's tech specialist tracked the route and brought back the confirmation I had expected, but still trembled to read Home Network Blair's usage window, a distinct header oddity that matched 2 other messages. Data had no pity. That was its gift. It did not care whether I cried. It could not be shamed by performance. It simply told the truth about where a thing came from and when. We debated the shape of the confrontation. My impulse was to walk into my mother's living room with a recorder and let her talk herself into a corner. Margaret, ever cautious, agreed, but built guardrails. She prepped me with open-ended questions, phrases that sounded like the kind of daughterly confusion Elaine would want to soothe with exposition. I went to the house wearing the steadiness I had been practicing, a small device in my purse, and I let them perform their concern exactly as expected. The recording captured Blair's attempt at superiority, the laugh too brittle by half when she insisted that people believed them, not me, and Elaine's little sighs perfected over years of church committees and neighborhood boards. When they finally understood, I had brought receipts, the mask slipped enough to let the contempt show, and that was what the audio needed, the shift from theater to truth. It was not a full confession, but it was an admission of the power they had weaponized and the audience they counted on to applaud. Aunt Susan set a dinner at her cottage where family members who still had their own questions gathered around her old oak table and listened to the recording without interruption. I watched faces I had loved my whole life undergo quiet recalibration. The aunt who had half believed the uncle who had opted for neutrality. The cousin who had waited for me to be less dramatic, as the pattern unfolded with timestamps and attachments, and what would have once been unbelievable now felt obvious. People apologized without making their remorse my job. It did not fix the past, but it made room for a future that did not require me to constantly defend the ground beneath my feet. Days later, a text came from a friend who keeps an ear to the industry wind. The Andrews family had finalized plans for Blair's engagement party at Oak Ridge Country Club, an event that would gather the very audience Elaine preferred, Old money, newer money, the kinds of people who pass reputations around on polished trays. Margaret and I looked at each other and did not need to narrate the thought forming between us. The lies had been public. The truth would be too. It wasn't vengeance we were planning. It was clarity. But clarity unveiled in a room designed to uphold a certain kind of narrative would feel like a rupture. We did not move recklessly. Margaret prepared a presentation that was less performance than ledger, a clean sequence that began with provenance and metadata and advanced through verifiable instances of interference in my work, my friendships, and my love life. She printed packets for individuals we knew could sway the room's center of gravity. Thomas's father, a retired judge, whose regard Elaine courted with nearly religious devotion. His mother, whose philanthropy network braided through the same circles Elaine prized. A few elders in our extended family, whose opinions Elaine had always treated like currency. And select clients and colleagues whose first-hand experiences illustrated the damage done. There were no surprises in the slides beyond the simplicity of their arrangement. Nothing manipulative, no secret footage, only the relentless straightness of a line drawn through years of manipulation, until even the eye trained by allegiance had to admit the line really was that straight. Elaine must have felt the tremor of activity. She arrived at my apartment in a cream suit and a voice steeped in sugar, the kind of presentation that had got her through decades of rooms where she wanted to be seen and obeyed. She told me she was concerned about my behavior, a phrase that landed now exactly as it was meant to land, and suggested I think carefully before I did anything at the engagement party that would embarrass the family. She cited boards and donors and the Andrews parents' refined sensitivities. I thanked her for her concern and said nothing about the evidence. If she wanted to imagine control, I let her keep that fantasy for 2 more days. When she left, it felt like the last time I would ever perform receptivity for her benefit. The night before the party, the team gathered in Margaret's office for final checks. The forensic specialist confirmed the chain of custody for every file and physical document. The audio had been cleaned only to enhance clarity, not to alter content, and we had notarized statements from people willing to speak. Aunt Susan reported which relatives had committed to attending, and quietly, which ones Elaine had warned away. We built contingencies. If they tried to deny me entry, judge, in the lobby. If they accused me of causing a scene, security briefed on the existence of counsel. If they spun the narrative of mental instability in that room, documentation ready delivered to the people whose opinions could not be dismissed as biased. The calm that settled over me felt like inheritance from a version of myself I had not met before, patient, precise, unwilling to be hurried by anyone else's discomfort. I chose a dress that did not apologize for my presence, but also did not come to fight. My father called early the morning of the party, his voice uncertain, carrying Elaine's latest script about my supposed threats to the family's peace. I told him we would talk after tonight, and that the words he used would matter. He did not understand, not yet, but he did not argue. The ground beneath him had begun to shift, and he could feel it even if he could not name it. We arrived 90 minutes before guests began to fill the ballroom, moving through the service corridor with the catering staff and the audiovisual crew. The anteroom adjacent to the main hall held equipment for toasts, and Margaret secured permission to test the projector, settling my laptop into place while I tucked extra copies of the packets into my portfolio. The carpet smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. I had expected trembling, but my hands were steady as I smoothed the cable against the table's edge and checked the first slide, a simple title card that said nothing dramatic, only the quiet promise of evidence to come. I heard my father's voice before I saw him pitched low, asking a security guard to give us a moment. Then Elaine's tone cut through soft and sharp, at once the sound of someone who believes every room is already on her side. The guard approached with professional politeness to tell me I needed to leave because of a restraining order. The lie was a masterpiece of escalation, crafted to discredit me and block the truth in one sweep. Margaret stepped forward, her bar association card and a printed court search in hand, explaining with measured authority that no such order existed and that repeating the claim would constitute defamation per se. The security guard shifted eyes, moving from her credentials to the growing cluster of faces peering toward the anteroom. Retired Judge Thompson, silver-haired and tall, arrived on a current of curiosity that turned almost instantly into scrutiny as Margaret handed him a packet. Blair hovered behind Elaine in a dress designed to catch light and attention, her expression composed, but flickering at the edges where panic keeps flexing its fingers. Thomas's mother joined her husband, and the first page of the packet rearranged her face, the cover memo that explained the structure, the list of exhibits, the note about forensic verification. My father stood off to the side, untethered, guilty, and hopeful in equal measure, the way a man looks when he begins to realize he has been used to wound someone he loves. It would have been easy to aim for spectacle in that moment, to deliver a speech I had rehearsed in 1,000 midnight drives, but that was not what this room needed. It needed a hand on the door and a light turned on. It needed simple, sequential truth that did not run or shout. When the judge suggested we review things privately, I heard a younger version of myself wanting the safety of small rooms, but I no longer lived where those rooms were built. The lies had circulated freely without my consent, and the truth had a right to the air, too. I told him as much, and his eyes, which had measured evidence in courtrooms all his life, gave a small nod that felt like permission and challenge at once. More guests had arrived, drawn by the murmur that follows the phrase, "There's something you should see." Margaret adjusted the projector. The hum of the machine filled the anteroom and spilled into the ballroom like a low chord building toward release. Elaine attempted one last preemptive spin, framing my presence as an episode and urging compassion from the crowd, but the words did not land as they used to. They wobbled and fell without purchase, because the room had become more interested in the stack of documents in the judge's hands than in her performance of concern. I took my place beside the screen and met the eyes that stared back, some skeptical, some sympathetic, many simply hungry for the clarity this city's social life rarely affords. This was the audience that had been coached to see me through a lens I had never chosen. This time, they would see the lens itself. The first slide weighted a quiet rectangle of blue light. I inhaled, feeling not the urge to fight, but the readiness to tell. The projector's glow stretched across the room, washing faces in pale blue. My heart pounded steady, but not frantic, the kind of rhythm you can walk to. "What you're about to see," I began, voice carrying further than I expected, "has been documented, verified, and authenticated. Every exhibit has been reviewed by professionals. These aren't rumors. These are facts." The first slide appeared an email from Blair to Michael, dated 3 years ago, the day after he met my family. Highlighted lines claimed I'd been hospitalized twice for alcohol poisoning that year. A quiet ripple moved through the room. The IP address traced back to our home, I said. Hours when only Blair was there. Blair lunged forward. "This is ridiculous." She fabricated. "Let her finish," Thomas cut in, his voice low, but sharp as hand, holding her back. The next slide, transcripts of a recorded phone call between Elaine and Mrs. Henderson, my client. She canceled my services after my mother told her I was being investigated for negligence. From the crowd, Mrs. Henderson herself stood, her face flushing. "It's true. Elaine called me personally. She sounded so concerned. I believed her." Elaine pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide. "I was protecting you, Davina. I didn't want you to be humiliated when it all came out." I didn't falter. "The next exhibits are medical records. On the left, my real history, no inpatient treatment, no substance abuse. On the right, the forged records James was shown. Forensic analysis proves they were created on a family computer. Gasps scattered like beads across the floor. Margaret stepped up, her presence steady. What you see here is not only defamation, it's deliberate interference with professional and personal relationships. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his sharp gaze scanning the documents, his jaw tightening with every page. His wife whispered to him, their eyes flicking from the papers to Blair, who looked as though the floor might open beneath her. From the back, a voice called, "I got an email too. Told me she was unstable, volatile." Stephen, someone I'd dated briefly, raised his hand. I believed it. More voices rose, hesitant but gathering courage. A client admitting Blair told them I'd stolen designs. A cousin confessing Elaine warned the family to handle me delicately. One by one, pieces of the pattern filled the air, undeniable. The final slide appeared, a timeline stretching years, linking relationships, opportunities, and sabotage into a web of interference. Judge Thompson stood, his voice cutting through the murmurs. As someone who has weighed evidence for decades, I find this pattern not only compelling, but deeply disturbing. In any court of law, it would constitute actionable defamation. The power in the room shifted. I saw it in shoulders drawing back and eyes turning toward Elaine and Blair with skepticism instead of trust. Thomas stepped forward. His face was pale, his voice tight. "Blair, did you send these? Did you lie to me?" "To everyone." Blair's lips parted, but nothing came. The silence was answer enough. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas slipped the emerald ring from her finger and set it on the nearest table. The metallic click echoed louder than any gasp. "I won't build a life on lies." Elaine's mask cracked then. "We were protecting the family reputation," she cried, rushing forward. "Everything we built. What poor choices, Mother." My voice stayed level. "Graduating, building a business, finding love. Those are the things you couldn't allow." My father's voice broke in from the doorway. "Enough, Elaine." He looked older, shoulders stooped, but his eyes were wet with shame. "I've read the documents, the emails, all of it. How could you do this to our daughter?" Elaine turned desperate, but found no shelter. Blair's eyes burned with naked hatred as she spat. "You never knew your place, Davina. You always had to ruin everything." I took a step closer, calm washing over me like a tide. "And where exactly was my place supposed to be, Blair? In your shadow forever?" She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit. Elaine hesitated, torn between her daughters, then followed. The silence they left behind felt like air after a storm, heavy charged, but finally clear. Guests shifted. Some approached me directly. Mrs. Thompson clasped my hands, her touch gentle. "No one should have to defend themselves against such cruelty." "I'm so sorry." Others followed, family members offering apologies, clients renewing interest in working with me, friends who admitted their doubts had been planted by whispers they now saw for what they were. Aunt Susan wrapped me in her arms. "Your grandfather always said you had his backbone. Tonight you proved it." Margaret hovered nearby, letting me receive what I needed, her small smile saying everything. This was what justice sometimes looked like, not fireworks, but steady truth spoken aloud. When the room thinned and the chandelier light softened, Thomas approached. His eyes were regretful, his voice steady. "I should have spoken to you directly. I'm sorry. Thank you for saving me from tying myself to this family's lies." I nodded. "You didn't know. Now you do." He left, and I stepped outside onto the terrace. The night air cooled my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt light. The weeks after blurred with rebuilding. Cease and desist letters went out bearing the cursive signatures of Elaine and Blair, proof they'd been forced to stop. My business grew, clients returning with trust renewed. My father showed up every Sunday for brunch, slowly learning how to speak to me without scripts. Aunt Susan moved back, reclaiming her life. 6 months later, my office was bigger, my team larger, my laughter freer. I launched a scholarship for event planning students from difficult families, honoring the girl I once was, and the ones still learning to fight for themselves. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold, I stood on my balcony and thought about the long road. For years, I had doubted myself, because lies had been told often enough to sound like truth. But truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be spoken once, with dignity and proof. I realized then, the deepest lesson family can wound, but family can also heal. Lies can destroy, but truth can rebuild. No one else gets to write my story. I smiled, breathing in the evening air, steady in the knowledge that their power had ended the moment I chose to stand in the light. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. End.